Now, you may have heard it said before that our whole life is mapped out. Basically, God knows it all from start to finish and the bits in the middle as well. But is that true? And how much influence as human beings do we actually have on that? So, for example, if somebody is diagnosed with cancer and it's terminal, and then they start to pray, and we have heard stories of this, they start to pray and the cancer disappears. What's happened there? Is that plan being changed, or was that in the plan all along and we didn't need to pray for it? Well, I'm glad it's not me answering this. So, Tom, what do you make of this? Over to you.
Well, that last way of thinking about the problem is also related to how we recognize miracles. But if we just stay on the theme of what's the point of praying? What's the point of even choosing anything differently if we can't change God's plan anyway? Shouldn't we just be fatalistic or resign ourselves to a sort of divine determinism where God steers everything and we really don't have significant choices? So there's this idea that God has a plan, that certain outcomes are planned. And this actually can be quite comforting in certain circumstances. You can sort of say, well, I don't know what's going on right now, but God has a plan, or I'm sure there's a plan somewhere for this. But what relevance do our choices and our prayers have? Is God's plan really fixed? Are we really free or not? So when you read the Bible, if you read a Bible, you'll find that in the Bible, there are passages which some passages affirm and speak of God's sovereignty and God's foreknowledge. So God knowing the future and God being in control of everything, God having a plan, that side of it. Then there are other passages which speak of human freedom, which identify human choices as highly significant to the way God reacts to things. For example, God takes the choices that human beings make to not have friendship with him, not have a relationship with him. He takes those choices very seriously. He respects and dignifies those choices. So you get both sides of it presented in scripture. Try to just think about the following examples. Have you ever seen somebody going down the top of a slide? Maybe you've been in a children's playground and it's one of those twisty slides where you can't see the bottom when you're getting in at the top. You see somebody getting in the slide and you also see somebody else, messing about at the bottom of the slide. It's not completely clear. And the person slides down and you can sort of almost see an accident about to happen with perhaps a little bump of heads. Or maybe you know somebody really well, maybe one of your kids, maybe somebody, a really close friend, you know them really well. You know the first thing they do in the morning is that they make a cup of tea. Or you know that if you try to get your kids off Fortnite before you go out to football, you're going to need a bit of a buffer zone to deal with the back and forward that might occur. Oh, I want to finish this game. I want to go to the toilet. You need some space. Knowing those things are going to happen doesn't mean you cause them. That's the interesting thing. Now imagine an infallible weather barometer. Okay, so a weather barometer measures the pressure in the air and will tell you what's going to happen, really. But imagine we've got an infallible one somehow, a magical one that is never, ever wrong. Does seeing the person sliding down the slide, does knowing the person who's going to make the cup of tea or going to need some space before going to football, does knowing that the infallible weather barometer is saying that it's going to rain, does any of that foreknowledge actually cause those events to happen? Well, no, because you're observing free systems. You're just looking. And that's the situation I think that God is often in, where he knows what's going to happen. He's working within a free world, but because he knows about things happening and he knows where he can steer his plan through to both respect human and preserve human freedom, but also to sort of work within it so that he brings his outcomes, not just the randomness of human outcomes. This is what it means to talk about God operating in a free world and God having a plan. God's willing to respond to prayer. Therefore, prayer is meaningful and actually can change situations. Jesus, after all, teaches people to pray the Lord's Prayer and to ask that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Further thought here is that when we pray, it also can change us. It calms us down. It reminds us that it doesn't all depend on us. Prayer is asking God to get involved in your situation, in your struggle. I think prayer often for other people, particularly people who we might regard as adversaries or enemies, I think prayer for them, if we can pray for them, and it is possible, actually starts to create an empathy and a compassion in us. When you pray, you get a little bit of heaven in your heart and it changes your perspective. So when we hear about God's plan, this shouldn't cause us to view each other as robots, as automatons with no freedom. Instead, we can be comforted that whatever we end up and wherever we end up freely in our own journeys, when we walk with God, we're on an adventure with him, and God will work out our free choices with efforts, with prayer, with care. He'll work it out. The truth is that God's plan is to weave our free plans into his big plan.
My head is hurting after hearing all this. I genuinely think that in all the questions we've done, this is the only one where I've struggled with. And the reason is there's so much to take in and there's so much to sort of, because I think we hear this type of stuff and we start thinking of our own situations in there where we've had friends, you've had colleagues who, you've had thousands of people praying for them. And then the outcome that we were hoping for hasn't happened and they've died. And stuff like that has happened. And I think it's a real tricky topic, this, because it is, God is there with us. And I think I directed you to this once before. And it's the poem all about footprints in the sand. And it's talking about how during the difficult times, the person who's writing the poem, they could only see one set of footprints, and they asked God why, and he says, because that's the times that I was carrying you on my back. And I think it's the most beautiful thing ever, that. But I do struggle with the fact that, are we saying then that almost the start and the finish God knows, and the bits in between are influenced by prayer? They're influenced by the decisions that we make. Is that something that we should be going with?
Yeah, I think there are genuinely free choices that we make in the world. I think there is a genuine openness to the world. God knows where he's going to steer things, and he's able to steer around our situations and our choices so that his outcomes, his designs, his plans will still come through. I don't know if you've ever done dodgems or been on the dodgems.
Of course, who hasn't?
Now, the key when you're doing dodgems is always to look for a couple of rounds before you go on and remember the numbers of the fast go-karts, of the fast dodgem carts, isn't it? So you get the good ones, we always say. And then there's this rush on at the end of, and you stand by the one and you hope you get the quick one. At least that's what I always did. Well, when somebody's very slow in a dodgem cart, they're making their own choices, they're steering, but you can steer around them if you're skillful and if you've got a fast dodgem cart. I think that's a bit like what God does. He is working in situations. He's not standing back and going, oh, I'm just interested in the beginning and the end. I'll do nothing in the middle. He's steering through. He's involved. He's actually jumping into the slow dodgem cart and he's saying, I'll help you. I'll look after you. I'll be with you.
It's a real interesting one, this. Almost, I think it could continue onto a second edition, this one. I think we could continue this next week because there's questions coming in right now.
Or the week after.
Asking, well, that's it. And we love your response on this. We love it when you can tie in with what Tom's saying into your own life, because that's what it's all about. Tom agrees that it's not just him coming on and we all nod and agree and go, oh, yeah. yeah, he's a clever man and he must be right. Well, he is a clever man, but he'll also admit that on topics like this, you've not got all the answers, Tom. And
No, of course not. Of course I don't. We're working it out together.
And I think it's great. And I would love to be a fly on the wall. Maybe I can be not a fly on the wall, but a person in the room when you and your colleagues get together and you start talking about these things, because I bet there'll be different theories that people you work with would say, well, actually, Tom, I don't think this, or they'd say, oh, yeah, I agree with that. Is that how it works in these fields?
Yeah. So yesterday I was sitting with Max Baker Heitch and Lara Buchanan, two of my amazing colleagues. And we were talking about the way that evils and pains and sufferings can be distributed through the world. And I was saying, well, I answered a question at the weekend when somebody asked me, and I answered it in this way. Do you think that's a helpful way to answer it? And they were saying, well, yeah, that could help in this way. And sometimes I put it like this, and here's something I read, and here's a bit of scholarship that's been done recently on this. And I just find it really healthy and helpful not to sit on my questions and to be silent and be on my own, but to be in community asking my questions. So at 11 o'clock today, actually, we have our team Bible study. And often John Lennox is there. And we're discussing how to understand Bible passages. We're working through the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew chapter 5 at the moment. And if you've never read Matthew 5, Jesus's main sermon, his core sermon, where he's talking about this goodness that goes beyond the goodness of the just keeping the external clean, that's amazing. So for me, a lot of it is I live in a community, and Christians ought to live in a community of discussion, of asking questions, of working things out, of exercising our free minds to discover God's plan.
Can you send me a selfie of you and John Lennox later on today?
Yeah, I'll give it a go.
Tom, always a blessing. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions that you would like us to put to Tom for future weeks, then the email is studio@connectradio.com.